When you're getting started learning to play jazz, and especially the first time you try to play a jazz standard,
1, 2, 3, 4.
One of the biggest stress factors is how fast the chords change and how difficult it is to keep track and at the same time play something that actually sounds like music. To reduce jazz chord stress syndrome, you need to be able to simplify the chord progression. Now, in the beginning, this can really help you play much better solos. You don't want to play solos where nothing makes any sense and you're only busy trying to hit every chord change on the page. There are two main strategies for this. One is harmonic and the other is in a way more guitaristic. Now often you're told to choose one or the other, but that's not the way to go. You want to combine both in a larger, much more powerful concept. But I'll get to that later in the video. I'm sure you've heard of Barry Harris, and otherwise look him up on YouTube, you won't regret it. I was lucky enough to get to study with him for a short period of time when he taught masterclasses at the Royal Conservatory in The Hague, where I was studying at the time. One of the most common chord progressions in jazz is the 2-5-1. Now, since you run into that everywhere, it's very practical to have a way to simplify that progression. And Barry has a way to do this, and as you will see, there are other bonuses as well. For this video, I'm going to use the song Afternoon in Paris as an example. And if you look at the chord progression in the A part, then you have first C major, which is the key of the song also. Then that goes to B flat major with a 2-5-1, so C minor to F to B flat. Then you get a 2-5 to A flat major. And then it returns to C major for a turnaround. Now, Barry's take on the 2-5 is that the 5 is the most important chord, and you can just ignore the 2 chord. And Joe Pass completely agrees with him.
I'll tell you, if I have a 2-5, forget the 2. You don't need it.
And if we relate this to Afternoon in Paris, then it actually makes quite a lot of sense. You're starting on the C major 7. Now the C minor 7, F7 is reduced to F7 just, and then resolving to B flat. The 2-5 to A flat is just E flat 7, and then we're on A flat major 7. So notice that like this, it really just moves in fourth intervals and also connects in a sort of very clear way. So there's a logic built into it, making it easier to play beyond having fewer chords. Now that logic is not always there, but it does happen quite often in terms of harmony. Then I think Joe Pass and Barry Harris really do have a point. And I think also often this way of reducing the amount of chords makes a lot of sense for the song. And don't forget that your solo also makes more sense because you're not busy with as many chords. Here I'm first playing all the changes and making an effort to spell everything out. And while this previous example was constructed to be clear, then it is different if you compare it to playing only the 5 chord of all the 2-5s. That does sort of add a bit of rest to the melodies. So this works really well, but there are a few places where it might look like a 2-5, but the important chord is really the minor 7 chord. One example that I will also return to later is a 3-6-2-5. So E minor 7 to A7 to D minor 7 to G7 in C major. But you'll also see it with 4 minor chords like F major 7 going to F minor 7, B flat 7 to C major 7. But it is still a good place to start, and it makes it a bit easier to think about what melody you're playing instead of thinking about a lot of different chords. Pat Martino's take on a 2-5-1 kind of flips the whole thing around if you compare it to Barry Harris.
In other words, if I were to improvise substitutionally against an A7th in this particular position, as I discussed before, I use personally, through my own choice, I enjoy using a minor 7th, a perfect 5th higher, from the root being the name of the key center of the chord. So this being an A7th, my personal choice is an E minor 7th.
Even if his way of thinking doesn't really work for you, then it's kind of hard to argue with lines that sound this convincing. He also turns the 1 chords into a minor 7 chord. And you can let me know in the comments, but I think there's just something very comfortable about thinking of everything as a minor 7 chord. It's a little bit like reducing things to minor pentatonic with a few added notes. And one thing that can be very useful for this approach is that you often can create connections in the chords that help you connect phrases in your solo. And of course, you're also just adding more rest to your solo because there are fewer chords to solo over. Now, Afternoon in Paris would give you something like this. Starting on C major, just like the last time. Now the 2-5 becomes C minor, that moves to B flat. Then you get B flat minor, that moves down to A flat. And here you can play a solo where there's a clear connection between the phrases because you're using the shift from major to minor in every modulation. Of course, with a song like Afternoon in Paris, this is extra clear, but that is a fairly common modulation, and this same type of melody can be applied to 4/4 minor progressions, which is another very common building block in jazz standards. In the end, I think the best reason for using Pat Martino's strategy is that this way of thinking appeals to you, it makes it easier for you to play solos, and it sits well with your ears. So what is better? Now, in general, it never works to only look at the type of chord, because a chord is always in a progression, in a song, and almost always in a key. But you will find people who swear by one system and think anything else is wrong and pointless. But mostly that's in the comment section of some internet plays and should not be taken too seriously. What is much more common is that people are aware of both systems and use whatever works better at that moment or at that part of the song. And that is probably the biggest advantage to both reduction techniques. They are about grouping together chords and thinking about them as one thing. That's a much more powerful tool and something that will do a lot of things for your playing. Let me show you. This way of thinking is probably a more clear extension of the Barry Harris approach than Pat Martino, but I think it's useful to stay open-minded also because there are places where Martino's reduction will make so much more sense. Now, there are two main advantages to looking at chord progressions like this. You can reduce the amount of chords, you can understand how progressions are similar even if they have different chords, and once you can do this, you have several tools that help you create chunks that are easy to remember when you're learning a song, because you can reference similar progressions in other songs. And actually that's something that makes you immediately have an idea about how it sounds. Just think about how powerful that actually is. I mentioned that if you're just looking at the chord types, then you are missing a part of the picture. So let me show you where this falls apart and what works instead. Then I'll show you why grouping in functions is a great way to understand harmony, and also why substitutions are definitely not. This is the 3-6-2-5 that I talked about earlier, and it is tempting to reduce this one by looking at it and then saying, well, E minor A7, that's a 2-5 in D major, and then that's followed by a 2-5 in C major, so D minor 7 to G7. That would mean that if you're using the Barry Harris reduction, then you're playing one bar of A7 and then one bar of G7. But A7 kind of sounds out of place here, and that's because it's actually resolving to the D minor 7 that's in the progression. So it doesn't sound like it's the 5 chord in D major. And a better way to look at this is to realize that it is a turnaround in C major. So E minor 7, A7, D minor, G7 kind of sounds similar to C major to A7 to D minor 7 to G7. And this progression is something that Barry would reduce in a completely different way, because the last part, the 2-5, well, there you throw away the 2 chord, so the D minor 7 is gone, and therefore the secondary dominant leading into that 2 chord, which is the A7, is also thrown away. And then you have C major 7 and G7. And that reduction also works a lot better with the 3-6-2-5. So you can't just look at the chords, you need to take the key into account to realize that E minor 7 is in fact a tonic chord, and that A7 is actually not that important. But that will also give you some other advantages. Let me show you. The minor subdominants are a beautiful sound, also very common in jazz standards. And thinking of those chords as a group can make a lot of progressions a lot easier to understand. The most common use of the minor subdominant is as a way to get back to the tonic chord. And the clearest example is probably just the basic 4 minor 1. And a common variation of that is to use the backdoor dominant, so B flat 7, and that will give you this. I'm sure you can hear how these sound very similar, and of course if B flat 7 works, then the 2 half diminished chord, which in this case would be D half diminished, also works, because that's really just a rootless B flat 7. And the flat 6 major 7 is also a great option, and in my opinion the most beautiful chord in C major. All of this is coming from knowing basic theory and checking out songs, and that is where theory can provide you with a massive boost, because it helps you understand the music that you already know and use that to make it easier to learn more. But you do need the right foundation, so check out this video so that you have an overview of what to learn and a practical way to learn it. It will make learning jazz 100 times easier and help you remove some of the annoying, difficult things like memorizing chord progressions and figuring out what to play over songs. Check it out, learn jazz, make music.